UK without the need for Foodbank.
How the heck are we going to get there?
We don't know how to do that.
I'm not sure the people have the will or interest to do what needs to be done.
I mean, I'd love to have a world where there's no need for a food bank, but the reality of it is,
I don't see that you can remove something like Foodbank when a government and a benefit system is so slow to respond when someone needs food today. Should we have no charities that cover any area of need? Should the government do everything or not?
Joining Steph and I today for the Hublife Podcast is Matt, who is one of the trustees of a food bank charity, and also we have Josh, who is an ex-food bank volunteer. Why did he leave? We'll get into that today.
Good drama.
And I want to frame the conversation today. So I've even got it on a bit of paper here that we are a Trussell Trust food bank, and Trussell's vision 3, 4, 5 years ago, all the way back to 10 years ago, was this: a food bank in every town. And over the last couple of years, they've reframed their vision to a UK without the need for food banks. So a UK without the need for food bank. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? What's your thoughts?
I think certainly when we first talked about that change in vision, it didn't particularly make sense to me. I always thought, how do you get from what seems to be an expanding need to then either have no need or palm it off somewhere else for someone else's responsibility? So ultimately, I think if you can remove all need, then that's brilliant.
so it can only be a good thing, can't it?
Yeah.
If nobody's hungry, then that's surely the end goal. But how do you achieve that? What's the best way to get there is the question, I suppose, isn't it?
And if the real fundamental question of that change in kind of vision is to end need absolute or to move it and someone else is going to fix that. So move it from it's a need, but it's still a need, just in a different location.
Okay, so effectively what you're saying is that the goal is desirable, that we could reach that, but if it's achievable or how it's achievable, you're unsure about potentially. And that is the point of this podcast, is that me and Steph have been tasked in our little local food bank to try and reduce the need for the food bank locally. We were talking about it, it's like, we don't know how to do that. We have
Particularly not at the moment either. Like at the moment, food bank is busier than it's ever been before. And so having a vision like that or a goal, like you say, is amazing to have. But how the heck are we going to get there? Yeah. Because right now that seems impossible.
Finding new peaks of demand.
Yeah, and maybe like we were quite excited like a year or two ago, and we were trying to think about strategically how we might reduce the need and the numbers coming through the doors. And then because of the cost of living crisis, it just kept going higher and higher. And we've done so much in the last couple of years. You might not be aware, Josh, that as an ex-volunteer, we now have citizens advice workers in all of our sessions, in all of the distribution centres. That's helping, but its numbers are still going up despite us putting that help in. And so it's maybe one of the parts of the jigsaw puzzle to do this. But this is the point of the podcast, and we want to get people's thoughts on it. And so we're just going to talk about every area of solution and see where, how the dice lay. Is that an expression? How the chips fall? Did someone say chips?
I think you hit the right word. It's drivers. So to find a solution, you've got to identify all the drivers, haven't you? And certainly, probably when we started it, I was probably quite naive in the extent of the drivers, probably how diverse that was. So how do you fix all of those drivers simultaneously within local budgets, government budgets, all those kind of elements? How do you do? Is it too big a thing to actually hit?
I think it's funny because we had a similar conversation, I think, a few weeks ago where we was talking about this kind of thing. And I said, I've been fortunate enough to never have to rely on benefits and things like that. My parents have not had to rely on benefits. A lot of the people around me are in a similar position. I think especially when I was volunteering at the food bank, it gave me quite the eye-opening experience that all of us have one or two bad decisions or one or two not even problems, not even your own decisions.
Yeah, an employer's decision, or
away from being at a food bank and being in need. And so things like having a citizen advisor at a food bank is great, because there will be lots of people at food bank who aren't good with money, or need a helping hand to get to where it is that they need to get to not need a food bank. But I think there's also a lot of people who, through no bad decision or perhaps just one bad decision, have now landed themselves in a food bank. And I don't think any amount of advice from an advisor could help. I think they've just landed themselves in that poor situation.
Or being landed, like redundancy or anything like that could trigger it.
It could be somebody who's very good with money.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem at the minute with the cost of living crisis, is that people who are earning on a low wage can do everything right, and it just doesn't cut it. Like,
simple maths.
Yeah, it's just maths, in and out, more going out than coming in on like just normal everyday things. And so, like, one of the solutions, and from Trust's point of view, they've done a campaign called the Guarantee Our Essentials campaign, and you might have heard of it, to basically campaign the government to up the universal credit. And so, like, I would say at least 75-80% of people who are in the food bank have some sort of benefit. A lot of the increased use we've seen is people who are in work, but many people who are just on universal credit. And before, it was the food bank uses when an emergency came along, but now it's not. It's just to get by.
Just the top up.
But that concept of increased universal credit, or the Guarantee Our Essentials campaign, which is basically saying if someone's on universal credit for whatever reason, they're in a place where they're having to claim that to live off, that should cover the essentials. And if it doesn't, then what's the point in it? But I'd like to get your thoughts on it.
It's difficult with the benefit system. Such a big topic. Ultimately, I think, personally, as big picture, the benefit system should be there to help people when they need it. And I guess most people would say that a benefit system that is properly and well targeted and well funded, it could happen to anyone, couldn't it? Like I said, so at that point of need, much I suppose like the NHS, not to get there, but at the point of need, there would be some help for us. So certainly younger, I might have argued a bit more, kind of slightly more right on that, but I think it is there to help, isn't it? And like I say, it's got to be enough, and ultimately that's going to have to factor in inflation over the years, and it's always going to be a challenge, isn't it?
You may know or may not know that the universal credit went up in line with inflation, but it was in April, but not back when inflation was high, even still, like months and months before. And so it's sort of catching up to inflation. And so, like, there's a window of time where people haven't got enough. I think when universal credit was brought in, I think it was tried to pitch it where the amount was to cover the essentials, to act as a driver for people to want to work instead of reliant on them. So it was like pitched as low as possible. I think it's lower than the legacy benefits that it replaced. And so, like, I think many people would think that's probably a sensible amount, is that it's just enough for people to get by. But Trust of Trust would probably argue, and Joseph Roundtree through the Guarantee Our Essentials campaign, is that the rate it is now is still not enough. And so I know you probably don't know the details of the amounts, but what are your thoughts if there was a big uptick in universal credit to allow people, from Trust's point of view, from Foodbanks' point of view probably, to actually afford the essentials? Do you think that would politically go down well? And what are your personal opinions on it? Like,
It is hard, isn't it? Because kind of the really right-leaning side of me wants to say that, like, any kind of benefit should be, for lack of a better word, slightly uncomfortable to encourage people to work. But then the charitable kind of, person in me, and the person who's been in food bank and stuff and can appreciate that there's some people who will never work, there's some people who want to work and can't work, or whatever their situation is, says it's not fair to make them uncomfortable forever. Yeah.
And that's the problem that I'm seeing these. I mean, I could go give you story after story, but I'm seeing people who are, through no fault of their own, walking into food bank because they've had a back injury at work and haven't been supported properly through, their employers or whatever, and now having to go onto universal credits, unable to support their family. When you're dealing with these people week in and week out who are, sometimes very emotional, and it's like they haven't got enough money to live, and this is no fault of their own. They were going to work, they've got an injury.
Yeah, and I think there is a role for employers to play in that. I think that you could argue that they play with corporation tax so much that actually, like they've done with pensions over the years, you could kind of have some kind of system that forces better sick pay, better protection for people, that prevents the needs for kind of landing in, I think, what is still an inefficient benefit system, really, even though some areas have been simplified. But I think part of it for me is the element of speed. I don't, kind of jump back slightly, I don't see that you can remove something like a food bank when a government and a benefit system is so slow to respond when someone needs food today.
Yeah.
I don't think you can't rely on that when they're not open, it's out of hours, all those kind of things, where a food bank is so much easily accessible that you've got X days food now ready. So I don't think you can make government.
If you've exhausted every single credit card because you've been made redundant and you've got no money and you've got nothing behind you, you haven't got 6 weeks to wait for, to go and do your Tesco shop, have you? You've got to have something there, and especially if you're a person with a family or whatever, you've got nobody to rely on. You haven't got time to wait. It has to be immediately, doesn't it? And that's, unfortunately, I mean, I'd love to have a world where there's no need for a food bank. There's nobody that ever goes hungry and stuff. But the reality of it is that even when the economy was probably, I'm still relatively young.
Compared to us,
I'm still just about to say that. I think even when the economy was at its best, people were still being made redundant. People were still falling on hard times. There was still a benefit system. So at what point do you go, actually, we're doing all right, there's no need for a food bank anymore?
Yeah, so if you rewind 10, 15 years when food bank use wasn't as high, the need's still there, but it's smaller. Yeah. And so even when things are going well, and so what it sounds like is it's the speed of help rather than the level of help that might be the problem. Well, maybe a year ago. Now with the cost of living crisis, it's compounded and maybe isn't enough. But before that, it was just the 5-week wait for universal credit. Sometimes it had been longer than that, or appeals processes and things. But what's the solution for that immediacy when there's an emergency or requirement today? And so perhaps you'd be more okay with no food bank or no immediate charity or third sector response if government or local government could play that role.
Yeah, I think as long as someone's there to do it.
Yeah. And
I suppose it depends, again, on your thoughts. I don't think, as try and be a useful person in society, I don't think that I should wait for an organisation or government to be there to do everything. Should we have no charities that cover any area of need? Should the government do everything or not? Should we let everything fall on government? I don't necessarily think we should.
And that is the sort of the point of the conversation, I guess, is whose responsibility is it? For me, it comes down to individual choices initially, and then close family, and then maybe local community, church, wider network, schools, all that sort of thing, then local council, and then government last. I think that's my natural tendency. But when I meet people at a food bank who don't have any family, who aren't really connected in any community local group, who don't know how the local council system works or any local welfare system, they are directly reliant on government sometimes. And it's like that ideal of how society should be structured perhaps in our mind, but doesn't necessarily work for all individuals. And it's them individuals that I'm concerned about the most, probably.
There's no perfect solution for every one person or situation, is there, as well? So how do you create a mesh of systems or networks that meet everyone's need in different times at different ways? Just jumping back to even we're talking about universal credit not being high enough now, equally, let me throw that question back. How do you make it the other way? So the government says inflation is going to be 10% for the next year. So we preemptively go, right, so we're going to raise universal credit in advance of that now. Yeah. Because then it could go the other way, couldn't it? And it's difficult, isn't it? Because you can either make the budget excessive. We could spend 50% of our budget on benefits and the NHS and forget everything else, couldn't we? But it doesn't necessarily cover everything that we need. So you either have to go with a lagging indicator of kind of these measures or a forward measure, or you do it so closely that you do it every week, or and constantly.
It would have to be monthly incremental changes. What are your thoughts then about, for instance, the up in universal credit today? I think that isn't a silver bullet. I don't think that one thing's gonna do it, but it might take a big chunk out of the pie. What are your thoughts instead? Like the government have just brought out again these one-off payments for the cost of living crisis for people on benefits. And so like I think it's £309 or something that's coming, and then another one in the autumn, I believe, as well. And so I think that's their response to the cost of living crisis, and would hopefully help people who are using Foodbanks at the minute. But do you guys think that that's just a cop-out like way of not upping universal credit, but a gesture of we're doing something but not having our hands tied? Like I'm sure the Tory government, when they upped universal credit during COVID and then wanted to bring it back, were put under pressure not to do that. And so like going forward, they might think, oh, we better not put anything in stone. It's one-off helps that we can then, well, it's gone now. And is that a bit of a cop-out from a government?
The big question though is who's paying for that?
Yeah.
And that it sounds really kind of harsh, but ultimately that money's got to come from somewhere, doesn't it? If we up universal credit, tax goes up.
For me, you're rearranging the problem sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
You're increasing tax burden. So again, on lower middle earners who may be a month off using a food bank, you're now suddenly potentially going to push some of them into that need because they're going to have less disposable income. So should we finance it through tax, or actually, I do quite like the nature of food bank and charity and generosity, because people are giving from disposable income in a realm where they feel comfortable, and then if they couldn't do that the next month, they can do that. But if it's tax, then you are fixing these things that pushes that problem somewhere else.
And I suppose the problem with that model is that would be great if the charity provision or food provision or whatever, we can take food bank off the table, any form of provision from the charity or third sector that's helping people, that's not necessarily homogenous through the country and evenly spread with services. You might have a city that does something amazing, but another city, there's no provision at all. And so that's where that becomes difficult. But so the one-off payments then, do you think that's just a sticking plaster then, and trying to hope to get through to the next election maybe, or what are your thoughts? I don't want to get too political about it, but like...
Yeah, ultimately it is though, isn't it? Fundamentally, I suppose there is that element that's difficult to get away.
I think every decision that, to be sceptical, I think any decision any government makes is only to get to the next election, isn't it? Because that is very sceptical, and as it came out of my mouth, I realised what I'd said. But
and they're all evil. Is that what you're saying? We can clip that. Yeah.
Well, most of the decisions aren't based on the greater good, are they? They're not on that element. So I think
they are very much influenced on what that's going to look like to everybody else. So it's hard, isn't it? Because I think if they thought that upping universal credit might win them the vote, then they probably would pick that as well. So
it might have been done. I think sometimes it comes down to how do you refer someone's agenda, do you? Because actually, in the right model, a top-up payment could be perfect. It could be really good.
Yeah.
But if it's done like you say,
it could be immediate as well.
It could be quicker. It could be more responsive to kind of changes in costs and all that kind of stuff. But if it's someone just going, just to get them off the back.
Yeah. Well, the trouble is that what I see is that we've got levels of inflation, and so like. Even if, let's say that the government have got this bang on and these top-up payments were just the right amount to top up universal credit to the level that it could cover everyone's essentials, that one-off payment's great. And then at the end of the year, inflation hits zero. And then payments that are now stopped, and you go back to the universal credit. To get back to the essentials level, you'd need deflation at the rate of the inflation. Otherwise, you'd need a new rate of universal credit to make up for that level of inflation. We think when inflation has stopped, that's great, it's all over. It's not. Everything costs more money now.
It's at that level. It's not gone down.
And so like that's the danger of them one-off payments, about thinking as a sticking plaster, that as soon as you take them out, there's then that massive void that's then on one day, you have maybe millions of people who are then in a pickle.
I suppose I would argue that the top-up payments are maybe a way to get through the year and make up shortfalls for people, and then come year end, reassess, new level based on that. And that, because obviously inflation could be 0 across a year, but actually the monthly basis it could be much different. So the top payments can make a big difference in kind of managing reducing the need and the peaks and troughs. And I think the problem is that, again, because it's such a political subject, if as decent human beings, everyone could remove the politics from it and go, how do we look after people? How do we make sure that Joe across the street is fine? How do we make sure that my sister in wherever is fine if we kind of remove that need, then, and kind of remove the stigma of benefits, because I know a lot of people who are so anti-benefits, but if they needed it, they would be so grateful. But and I'd probably say pre-Foodbank, I was probably more cynical of kind of the benefits culture as well. But if we can just remove, I know, never going to remove politics from it, are you? But how do you look after people and kind of meet those needs?
And I suppose probably then most people would agree we'd want universal credit or benefits for the people who really need it for it to cover it. And so I think most people would think, up it to the level that it needs to be, even if it costs us money. And it's just the people, like you said, who are anti-benefits, and I think that maybe comes from, and like you said, that they'd want it if they were in that position. They'd then be like, we need this.
Because they don't feel they'd be taking advantage of it.
And that's the thing, it's the people's mentality that are thinking that a lot of people are misusing it. And so let's be real, there are going to be people that always try and play the system in every area of life, not just benefits, in absolutely every area of life, like 10%, let's just say. But like from my point of view, building a policy around those people instead of the majority of people who are using it right, and it's really difficult to convince the whole populace of that. And that's perhaps why government are finding it difficult to say, let's just up universal credit, because there's so many people who would be against it in principle. And so it's a very difficult balancing act.
I'm not sure the different pockets of people have the will or interest to do what needs to be done. Because like I say, in a city in the north, the solution could actually require something very different than something in rural Norfolk. That is just very different, isn't it?
Yeah. And I suppose as well, like, even if there is a solution and we've not come up with it yet, and the next guests on the podcast go, here you go, here's a list, this is just what you've got to do. Is that permanent? Because if the last few years have taught us anything, something just really unexpected can happen, and all of a sudden the whole country is locked in the house on 80% wages, and and all of a sudden there's a huge need for food banks
with no infrastructure. They don't exist.
And now they don't exist because we didn't need them, because we've solved it, and that's the problem, isn't it?
I suppose that is a danger of succeeding, isn't it? Imagine in 5 years' time we've eradicated the problem almost to nothing. There's a few ad hoc food parcels going in small local churches, and then something does hit. It took years to build up the infrastructure. And I think actually communities do respond incredibly quickly in these sort of environments. And so I think the response would be very quick. If we didn't run a food bank and then there was a need again, we'd just step up and do it. But I think you're right that there would be a lag phase and a big infrastructure problem, and just even the donor network and all that's been built up. And so
people work that you legitimately have to have in place for all these things is important, isn't it?
So there are dangers to it, and it'd have to be done very well, and have things in the background, or the benefit system being incredibly responsive and very quick. And then I thought about this idea as well. What about, like, for those people, to get people on board who couldn't get on board with universal credit uplift at all? What about, do you think you could convince people in your cohort of people that you might talk to who are against that sort of stuff, if that increase came in the form of like a food card, dedicated food card that could be spent only on food? Do you think that would tilt people into being like, then we can get on board with that? Enough momentum behind it that a government could make that decision without the fear of being voted out of government. Do you think that would be I
don't know how much of it is what people are spending their money on. I mean, I don't know. Without doing a survey, I don't know how much of it is what are people spending their money on, or is it the fact that they don't have to earn it? I think is the.
I think it's both. Something like a food card, as much as some of that comes with stigma again for the people, the recipients. I mean, we live in an age of technology where no one can tell if you're scanning your phone to pay or to use a voucher, so you could get over that. And do you think it'd be less of a stigma than walking in a food bank? I think potentially.
I think probably.
I think it would.
Like going to a supermarket with a prepayment card, there's 4 food payments that is part of a benefit, universal credit uplift instead of the uplift. For me, it's exactly the same amount of money, but like to give security to the people who are worried about abuse of the system.
I think it undercuts that argument. I think that's probably the key part, is that there is an element of control built into the system of what that can be done with. And you know me, I'm fussy with food, so there's probably things in the food bank parcel I'd be like, I'd have to be starving to go near that.
We have done a video on it. Watch it on YouTube. Have a look back.
Maybe we should do another one.
With Matt. That would be brilliant. Make him eat it.
But I think, like you say, that the stigma of using a food bank, and actually the ability to go into a supermarket and make your own choices and kind of do it in a way that isn't kind of overtly, I've got a bright pink voucher for this, that, the other. I think that could be a big part of it. I think it removes some of the arguments why people don't like benefits.
It's a definite option, isn't it? If kind of half of the people are upset with what people are spending their money on, the other half are upset with the fact that they're not earning it, well, then you've eradicated half.
Let's fix half the problem.
Just enough to tip it into politically viable decision to increase the benefit payment for those in most need. And so I was thinking about it, like, could that be a solution? And then I thought about the stigma with it and stuff, and it's really difficult. To finish, I've got a list of top 5 things that people spend their money on. This is in the UK, and these are averages, obviously. But housing's the top one, which is, I've read anywhere between 24.8% and 29% of income goes on housing. So like for me, I'm a maths guy, and so like the number one cost is housing, 24.8% up to 29%. And so like that's the biggest outgoing. So like I've read on the internet, and which is obviously always right, is that social rented homes in England decreased from 2001 from 3.9 million to 3.6 million. So that's 8% down on social housing. But then council homes from 3.3 million in 2001 to 1.6 million in 2020. And so there's a 52% decrease in council houses. And so like you're pushing more and more people into the market, which is only going up and up and up. And Matt obviously knows a bit more about it than us working in that industry. And so like you're pushing people who want to be able to spend as little as possible on housing into a market that is just inflamed. It's inflated for many reasons, because like, and the population in that time, in that same period, has gone up 7.4% as well. So we've got more and more people with less and less social and council housing. And so like, which can only drive up prices. Yeah. And so the problem for me is that I read somewhere that like to keep up with the demand, government needs to be building, or local councils or need to be building 300,000 homes a year. And yet over the last 10 years, the average, I believe I'm correct, is about 130,000. So we're well behind. And so it's only going to get worse. And so this major expenditure that people, who's the biggest thing they're spending out on, is only going to be more and more and more going forward. And so like for me, the biggest, maybe even more so than uplifting universal credit, although that would be an immediate help, for longer term stuff, it's like, we need to build more houses. Just need more houses. And I know we're on a small little island, and like we can open the can of worms of immigration and whether we should or shouldn't and how much. But for me, it's like, it doesn't matter. If no one comes or everyone comes, we need to build the amount of houses we need for that amount of people for us to even catch up, let alone start reducing the costs of housing for people.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's the fundamental thing, isn't it? That the social housing, the council housing has been going down for a long time because of this aspiration sometimes of right to buys and giving people the option to buy their homes, which is...
You think that's good?
I think there's arguably a place for it if the council or housing association is replacing that stock.
That is my thought.
Another way around it. Yeah. It's supply and demand, isn't it? And I think, like I say, if we're not building enough houses, costs are getting worse the whole time. So how do you do that other than building more houses? And again, it's that balance, it's public-private sector, isn't it? Because the developers at times are sitting on too much land, and maybe there needs to be more kind of social housing built. But yeah, until you start building more houses, it's not going to change. I suppose the other side, maybe potentially in kind of the more fragmented society we live in, is about occupancy numbers as well. So it'd be interesting to see, as well as housing, social housing, council housing has gone down, what's the actual average occupancy number per home?
So you want to squeeze more people in?
No, well, you'd argue. I know. I spoke to some people a couple of years ago when they were trying to kind of, the whole spare room thing was going on, and remove kind of the person and the person I knew in the situation, the logic says you've got a 4-bed house. There's now just 2 of you there. Why do you need? You are part of the problem for someone else. Arguably, you could be releasing a house for a family of 4 who are struggling to live somewhere. So I think again, it's everyone playing their part.
I think that policy was actually a good idea. If you had the housing stock that people could then move,
redistribute people fairly.
In the same town at least, where they built networks of family and all that, and community, I think, and schools with kids I think it's so important, as opposed to just you're out of here and a town over. And so like it is a good solution, but I think for me, just building more houses is.
And again, we've all got to be prepared to have more housing and greater density in our local area, because it is not in my backyard, isn't it? That's what everyone says. We should have this, but not behind me, because I've got a lovely view of the river. Well, what about not there?
Can't build on the river, man.
View of the river. The other side of the river. I think that's it, isn't it? You have to go that way. We need more houses, and there's only certain ways you can do that. We all want nice big houses, but there's got to be a limit in how that works.
Like I said at the beginning, when I first came to Foodbank, I was probably quite far right. I'd still say I'm...
When you say far right, that's another clip. Right leaning. You know what you mean?
Yes. And I'd say I'm probably still more, more right than left. But the minute I kind of step through those doors at Foodbank and you see these people coming in and you realise that these aren't your typical benefits people, these are just everyone.
I like what you've done there. Because we have a view if you've never been involved or around that.
So you do build up this kind of idea as to who's on benefits. And I think actually, perhaps that's a way of doing it. Maybe everybody should spend a day in a food bank and realise actually there isn't one person coming into a food bank. It can be anyone. And
they don't necessarily want to be there.
No.
Most people don't.
No. If I was actually going to ask earlier, because I haven't been for quite a while, I know that when I was going, I would say at least 50% of the people going in had their heads down, didn't want to be there. And it's interesting, actually, it'd be interesting to know now, with that increase of people, is it the same? Is it,
I don't know about you, but I think the wider social stigma looking in has reduced a lot because the use of Foodbank has gone up and it's become more normalised. But to the individual, it's still the same. It's the same burden.
It's still a shame or guilt when people walk in that I shouldn't be here, I shouldn't need to use a Foodbank. Yeah. But I do think as well, people are more understanding, like you say. I think COVID was a big, people were so amazingly generous and supportive throughout COVID. But I also think the atmosphere has changed as well. Like for us, we've been, obviously when you came, Josh, it was a very different environment. So we were in an old classroom. It wasn't particularly nice. It was a bit dank and nasty, whereas now we're in a nice building. We've got a coffee shop and stuff. So it is different when people walk in. They feel more welcoming and less, I think, therefore that shame is still there, but it's not as present as it was before. Does that make sense? Oh.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's just a nicer environment. Yeah. That's what we've tried to do, is really, really make it, give people dignity when they come in. Yeah. And that's what we try and do as best we can. And I think that's ultimately what most people want to do, even from an individual level all the way up to policy writing level, that we want to love people and make sure people are doing okay. And so I suppose all of us agree that we want food banks to reduce in number, the people needing it, and something's got to change. We just don't know perhaps what that is. I think that's a good place to stop. So thanks for joining us, and please join us on our next episode of the Hublife Podcast, which will be out next Friday.
If you haven't done this already, then please subscribe to the Hublife channel. Go on, it's right here or there. I'm not sure where it is, actually. This is my first time. Anyway, make it work. See you later.